Hey guys, Niklas here from Your Audio Solutions. I hope you're doing well and that you had a great Christmas so far and that Santa brought you some awesome gifts. Today we have Ian Sefchick, who is a mastering and cutting engineer at Capitol Studios, and he has worked on records for artists such as Alabama Shakes, Glass Animals, Kid Cudi, and many others. Besides working at Capitol Studios, Ian builds the very popular Magic Death-like tube compressor and EQ that's been praised by many engineers in the industry. And this compressor is also available in a plugin form from DDMF, which you can check out online. There's a link to that below. If you're into compressors and all the geekery around compressors, this interview is for you. And in this interview with Ian, we spoke about doing direct to lathe sessions, the difference between compressors such as Vari-mu, FET, VCA, and Optical, how control voltage, tubes, attack, and release time work in a compressor, why you need to match the tubes in your compressor, the best way of learning how to hear compression, for example, using drums and other things, if there's a rule as to how you should deliver your mixes to a mastering engineer. And I've seen this coming up online quite a lot recently, so I hope Ian's answer can help you. What sidechaining compression is and the difference between feed forward and feed back type of designs in the compressor, look ahead compressors and how they work, and so much more in this interview about compression. I hope you're gonna like it. And before we get into the conversation with Ian, I want to tell you about a free guide you can download right away. It's called 3 Tested Ways to Increase Your Client Base. And I made this guide for people who are home studio owners, who work in a studio, or you just want to get your foot in the door of the industry. This guide is for you. You can download it below. There's a link to that. And you can learn my tested email script on how to contact bands online, how to build profitable relationships with people in the industry. Yeah, and as I said, how to get your foot in the door of recording studios, for example, and much more. Check it out. It's free. Link below. But that's it. Now over to Ian Sefchick. So first of all, yeah, thanks for coming to the podcast or whatever you want to call it, the show.
Yeah,
The
no
number that
problem.
is. So you actually told me last night you were on a direct lathe to streaming session with Beck.
Yeah, it was fun. He did a great performance, and we opened up both. There's two studios, two tracking rooms in Capitol, Studio A and Studio B, and they can be. There's a door between, a big folding door between the two, and when we do large orchestras, we'll open up both spaces, and that's what happened last night. They opened up the door, and both spaces were being used mostly for the audience,
Cool.
and the stage was at the back of Studio A, and yeah, it was a fun time. It was cool.
So, because you were obviously working to cut it on lathe, right? So, what is your role? Like, how do you prepare for that? What's your, what's the requirements to get it
Basically,
done?
they had it all mic'd up. I think they used their live rig, and they split the signal to Studio A, and so they went to Pro Tools there, and then I was fed a stereo mix up. We have lines that can be
Right.
put all over the building from Studio A, and I just put it straight to the lathe, and I do some EQ and analog stuff, and just try to hit the. It's not quite as easy as pressing record on a tape machine. With the lathe, it has to cut the lead-in groove, and you have to prepare for that. So it's a little iffy. Usually, this was kind of off the cuff. We did a test run with a band called Hey Violet, and it worked out really well. This was the actual first official Capitol cuts,
Oh,
and
cool.
we're still learning how to get the band to go, okay, we're gonna start now. Press, it's called fast on the lathe, and that you know drives the arm over and then drops it on the lacquer and cuts the lead-in groove, and then they can start. So it's never probably going to be timed perfectly,
Hmm.
but yeah, I just sit here and operate the lathe. Vinyl has certain things you have to do, like it doesn't like a lot of high end, so a lot of times you're applying filters in the high end, and it's actually, the lathe is good at cutting low end,
Hmm.
but mostly in mono. the way that the cutter works is it actually works in a mid-side type of thing where all mono is cut in a side-to-side like an S, and then the stereo or out of phase information is cut in an up and down motion.
Right.
So that's why the grooves don't just look like a single track wiggling side to side. It would if it was a mono source, but if it's stereo, you get this hourglassing, look as well as the side to side cut. And if you have information that's out of phase too low, because it makes the most energy physically, it will actually pull the cutter up, past the surface of the lacquer, and the hourglass will close up, and that will pop the needle out when you try to play it. Right. So what cutters do, what you have to do is mono information below, say, 100 hertz.
Right.
Depending on the whatever you're cutting, sometimes you have to mono it below 200 hertz. And that is what gives like a lot of the sound to a vinyl, is that mostly everything you're listening to, everything below a certain low frequency is mono. So it's tighter. It could be tighter.
Right.
So basically filters and monoing the low end is the most important part of cutting. The original Neumann, I work on a VMS 66 made in 1966, and it came with a analog de-esser. Right. That's how controlling the high end is with cutting. It was pretty heavy-handed, and I don't use it. I mostly use plugins because you can, like specifically the Fab Filter Pro DS, right, because I can get rid of a lot of the high end without it affecting, like just a high shelf. With most de-essers are just a high shelf that cut the high end. But the Pro DS seems to just pull out whatever frequencies are being, past a threshold, right, instead of a shelf, instead of the whole bandwidth above a certain point, which is great because I can still have high end in the cut and not have what happens on vinyl. If you have too much high end, is it'll distort out. You'll hear S-ing, right, kind of spatting, I call it. And it also depends on how loud you're cutting the source material to the lathe, and that depends on how much time you're trying to fit on a side. So it all kind of works together. But once you get the hang of what it can take, you can kind of work around that. And I mostly try to get the source material on the lacquer as close to the original source material as possible. Unless it's somebody requests they want to have it mastered specifically, and they want it for the vinyl, and they want it to sound different than the digital release, then I'll kind of do stuff differently. But 90% of the time, people want what the final master is, whether they had me do it or somebody else do it, to sound exactly like that on the vinyl.
So when you say you want to keep like 100, everything below 100, 150, whatever you said, mono, isn't that usually the case? Or what would be in stereo? Could it be synths and stuff, or? Synths,
or say, heavy metal guitars sometimes chunk along, and if that's out of phase, really classical music is really hard to cut because you'll have timpani on one side. It's often stereo spread a lot, and you can combat that if you don't have a lot of time on the side. Say that's why dance records, you'll have a 12-inch with 2 songs, because then you can actually set the cutter to cut deeper by default, and it'll have more leeway to pull up and down. And then you might not have to put the low end crossover, because even if there is out of phase low end information, it has some room to pull up a little bit. And cutting deeper grooves also helps cheaper record players stay in the groove. Right. It's only when you're, like, say you have something over 20 minutes worth of music that has to fit on one side that you have to start thinning the grooves and trying to fit more on, right, and turning down the level. as the level goes down, the little squiggles don't squiggle as much, and you can, the next groove can be put closer to the previous groove, so you can fit on. So it's all balancing time with volume.
Right.
The problem is if you cut too quiet, then there's kind of a default baseline of hiss and static just because of the physical medium. And it's not like CDs where you're trying to hit this 0 dB full scale level as close as you can. You have a limit as far as sound. You're trying to get louder because you want to stay as far away from that surface noise as possible.
Yeah.
But you can't get too loud because then you start distorting people's needles. So there's a sweet spot that you're trying to put most things. It's above the noise of the lacquer and below distorting the needle.
Right. That's very interesting, man. But so, could you explain the being in phase and out of phase a bit more? So when you say, for example, heavy guitars, why would they be out of phase, so to speak?
Well, because, you'd be, say they have 2 mics on the cab, or say they do 2 different guitars, one panned right, one panned left. You don't know if somebody's doing a chunk. It's not going to be specifically out of phase the whole time, but any moment that 2 notes that are played at the same time are out of phase, it's going to pull the cutter up.
Right.
Because, I could sit here for a half an hour and try to explain verbally why that happens, but it
yeah.
be boring.
Yeah, okay, man. But that's very interesting. So let's actually dive into the compression part, because I know you have your Magic Death Eye compressor, and which seems very cool. So maybe if we start, at the basic of a compressor, how if you can explain, the basic of the common knobs we find in a compressor and what they do, maybe for people who struggle with the concept a bit.
Yeah, I'll start with the different types of audio compression. There's usually it's an element that controls the gain. When you get louder, it wants to either keep it at one level or make it softer. There's a FET, like in 1176, where the FET just hangs on the input signal, and when it gets a certain voltage into it, it grounds the signal. And then there's an opto, like in an LA2A, and that uses an electroluminescent panel, which is basically like your old style night light, whereas you plug it in, it just glows green. That is put to an LDR, which is a light dependent resistor, and the more light it gets, the less resistance it has. So as that panel gets brighter, it again grounds signal. So there's the FET, there's the ELOP, as Manley called it, electroluminescent, and then there's a VCA, and that's used in, say, the SSL bus compressor, and that is a bunch of transistors that, again, they don't. You might not call it grounding the signal, but the signal actually runs through the VCA, and the VCA turns down the signal.
Right.
And all of these, and then there's what I make, the Vari-mu tubes, and it's the same concept as the VCA, more than the FET or the ELOP. The signal is going through the tubes, and it turns the volume down. But what they all use is what's called control voltage, usually picked up after the unit. And it takes the signal that's on the output, and it basically takes the AC signal and rectifies it to DC, and then puts that into whatever element is being used to turn down the music. So it's kind of like this feedback loop. The louder you get, the more signal is fed back, the more control voltage is fed back into whatever element is pulling down the music.
Right.
So those are the basic 4 ways of doing it. And there's famous compressors that use each one. And, the most famous compressor that uses the tubes to turn down the signal is the Fairchild, which I was always, you know, uh, infatuated with ever since the Bomb Factory Fairchild plugin came out.
Mm-hmm.
And I was really excited when I started working at Capitol because they have they have like three Fairchilds, two 670s and a 660.
Right.
And I was like, wow. And the first night I got into the studio and I put some stuff through. To be honest, it didn't quite sound like the plugin.
Right.
I mean, it wasn't, to me, it just wasn't as controlled. And, you know, I was like, wait a minute, man, this is not right. The plugin's sounding better. I mean, I guess I can say like texturally and sonically it probably sounded better, but the way the gain reduction was working, it felt more out of control. It didn't feel, and that later on I learned is because usually the tubes in the Fairchild, they're old, they don't match well, and for Vari-mu compression to work right, you have to have a very well matched tube or set of tubes.
Why is that, by the way? Because I saw you wrote that on your website too.
Yeah, because it kind of works in a push pull way, and it takes the differential signal, and it's instead of a single signal, it's working on two signals that are out of phase, and it combines them in the output transformer. And if the tubes aren't pulling the signal down at an equal level throughout the whole gain reduction, they start to thump around. They don't cancel perfectly, and that's when you get compressors that are thumping or kind of fluttering as you give it more compression. So that means the tubes aren't gain reducing both halves of that signal in the same way.
Right.
So, and usually it'll be fine until you start compressing, because tubes operate at a certain bias level just for passing signal. And then as you add that control voltage I was talking about, they start to turn down. And if your tubes aren't matched through the whole curve, then the two sides, the two halves of the differential signal will start turning down at different points, and they won't cancel perfectly. So that's why you can't just match a tube like when you buy a tube on eBay and they say matched. That's only matched at one bias point. So for Vari-mu tubes, you really have to put them through a tube matcher or a tube curve tracer to see the whole gain reduction envelope of each tube and match them like that, which I do. I buy new old stock 6BA6s and match them up. Now the JJ is the only company that is remaking the 6386, which is the original tube that was in the Fairchild. It was also in the Stay Level. It's also in those are the best known vintage compressors that use them.
Right.
And since they only made, those were kind of like a special tube for instruments. I don't know if it was in radio but they only made a certain amount of those. Those weren't like a common TV tube. So all the good ones, kind of like the VF14 for the U47s, have been bought or used, and JJ took the opportunity to remake them. JJ's remake isn't at all the same as the old ones.
Right.
I've done lots of testing, and I don't know why. I mean, they look a lot different. The plates inside them look different than the original ones. They work fine, but they're supposed to be sold with a certain percentage of matching within the two triodes. There's two elements in one tube of the 6386. And it's cool because the Fairchild uses 4 of them, so it all averages out. So you can usually, by pulling out tubes and switching them around, you can find where it compresses the most.
Right.
That's really the only way to kind of get the compressor. If you have a Fairchild and it's only doing 6 or maybe 10 dBs of compression, then it's starting to thump or flutter, try switching around the 6386s in the back.
Right.
And you can find a combination that works better usually because they wear differently.
But if we go back to the compressor again, you explained what compression is, the different types. Could you give us a brief explanation of the, for example, threshold, attack, release, and their relationship?
When you make that control voltage, when you turn the output AC into DC, then you can control in time how much or when that control voltage gets to the gain reducing element. So if you put a big fat capacitor on that control voltage, the control voltage has to fill up the capacitor before it can move on to the gain reducing element. So that would be time, that would be signal in time.
Right.
And you could say that could be attack, say. So attack, you make the attack slower, you put a bigger capacitor on there, and it takes longer for that control voltage to pull the gain reduction down. So if you have a snare drum and you set the attack slower, you're going to get the pop of the snare. It's going to slip through before the control voltage can pull down the volume.
Right.
And you can control that time. And the release is how fast the capacitor discharges to bring the element down as much as it needs to go. So a slower release time means it's slower to pull the voltage down. So the attack would be how fast it initially starts to pull down, and the release is how fast it comes back up. And then the threshold would be when it starts to do that.
Right.
So that's attack and release basically.
Cool.
And how it's with control voltage.
Yeah, makes sense. And for people, because usually when you start out, I know I did, it's hard to hear compression. That's probably understanding what it does and to hear it. It can be tricky. So do you have any tips on how to practice your ears to hear compression?
Well, yeah, I would start with like a stereo drum track. That's probably because it's very transient. It's a good way to hear what a compressor is doing. So, if most people just have plugins, a really easy one to understand is the 1176 or something. And it has attack and release, and it doesn't have threshold because it works by pushing more signal in with the input. So on an 1176, play a drum track, push a lot of input in, and turn the output down so you're not overloading your track. And you'll start to see it compress, and you'll definitely hear it. And, compress a lot, make the needle really swing, and then put the attack and release all the way one way and all the way the other way, and you'll start to hear how the drum track is changing its sound. You'll either hear, if you have the attack fast and the release fast, it's going to be really pulling down the drums as fast as it can and releasing it as fast as it can. And the drums are going to sound huge and like they're in a bigger room because every little part of the sound is going to be evened out. So you're going to hear the ring of the snare drum and the ring of the drums as loud as you'd hear the attack of the drums. And this is the big, kind of, John Bonham sound or whatever. You can make a small set sound bigger and more exciting. And say on a record I like a lot or a band, Broken Social Scene from, the 2000s, a Canadian band. And they had a great compressed drum sound that just sounded like all their drums were being really compressed a lot with fast attack and fast release. It's tough though, because when you play the drums alone doing that, it sounds really cool. And then you start to add more instruments on top of it and everything, it doesn't sound quite as cool. I think that's one of the mix mistakes a lot of people do when they first start mixing. They try to make each individual sound amazing by itself. And when you put them all together, then it just sounds like a big mess with no dynamics.
Yeah.
So It's an effect, but that's a good way to play with compressors, is just on a regular stereo drum track and just do everything to the max, and you'll
Right.
start to get a feeling for what it's doing.
Right. Yeah, that's a good tip actually. I think that's also what I used to do in the past. I think I do still actually.
Yeah.
um, I mean, is that also how you? I might be wrong in this, but when people speak about the tone of a certain equipment, compressor, or EQ, whatever, is that how you get the tone of a certain piece of equipment by, for lack of a better word, slamming it, so to speak, or can you still get the tone by being subtle?
Yeah, I don't know. Like, my philosophy about mixing is, I don't know. I don't subscribe to the whole tone thing. Maybe on a vocal or something, but all tone is distortion.
Right.
If you run something through a Neve 1073 and you feel like it has some type of tone to it, that's because there's added distortion to your signal.
Mm.
And um, it can be used creatively, and sometimes you just happen upon it, and oh, great. But buying a 1073 because somebody else says it has such a great tone is just kind of ridiculous. It's like, okay, let me buy it, and you have some crappy singer sing through the best stuff. It doesn't matter what the tone is. It all goes back to the performance.
Yeah.
And how good the band is and how good the song is. I mean, it's fun to imagine what tone is going to be like. In fact, that's what's back to my Fairchild story. That's kind of where the Magic Death Eye came from. Is I was like, this doesn't sound like what I imagined a Fairchild was going to sound like.
Mm.
And so I started building a Fairchild-esque compressor that I wanted to sound like I imagined it to sound. And that's where I feel like I got it to sound today. But it took years and years of experimenting and using different tubes and different sidechain attack and release times. And I wanted my own transformers, and I wanted to get, but mainly I have an Audio Precision, which is an old tool. Well, they make new ones. They're very expensive. And now you can buy software that does the same thing, but it'll show you frequency response, and it'll show you the amount of distortion, total harmonic distortion, and noise of whatever you're putting through it. So
Right.
that was a good tool for me to use in addition to my ears to see what any change that I made in the circuit was doing. I could sweep it
Mm.
and see how much distortion whatever I did added.
Right.
And in that way, I could kind of make the circuit. And I was going for the least amount of distortion, because tubes and transformers in general add a lot of distortion by default.
Right.
And so getting it to clean up was really nice. And that's what people say when they hear a Magic Death Eye. They go, oh, it's like a Fairchild, but hi-fi. And it's like, well, it has probably less distortion than a Fairchild. And I designed the transformers to be is to work the tubes as best as possible. Whereas when I believe his name was Rain Narma, when he designed the Fairchild, he used off the shelf what was available as far as transformers to match the impedances of the tubes. And I love UTC and Triad transformers because they were really an art back then of them. But they didn't have the frequency response that the Jensens or the Cinemags do that are in most boutique audio gear today. When Jensen started designing their transformer, they designed to have a cleaner and wider bandwidth than the old transformers. And they could do that by winding techniques that they used with a computer-controlled winder, which they didn't have in the old days when they made the UTCs and Triads. And they wanted a more perfect transformer, and they got that. So when people say, oh, it has transformers in it, it's like, well, yeah, does it have old transformers or new transformers? Because if it has new transformers, that's going to be more like a non-transformer piece of equipment.
Right. Yeah.
all the old uh, all the old magic pieces of equipment engineers would bring into Capital, they all had those old transformers in it because they weren't as good as the new transformers.
Hmm.
Good, technically speaking. They a lot of times would roll off right at 20K, which makes a nice little bump up there, which adds some high-end feeling. You know, when people say air, that's because it's has a bump kind of in around, 17K, 16K, not because it has a wide bandwidth out to 40K. Nobody can hear that,
Yeah.
So the kind of faults of the old transformer I emulated in my transformers,
Right.
and that's what I liked about them. So just because it has a transformer doesn't mean it's going to have a tone, and just because it has a tone doesn't mean it's going to be the right tone,
Hmm.
and it doesn't mean you're a good band or your song's good.
Yeah. No, no,
But have
no.
as much fun as you want.
Yeah. But that's very interesting, man, because it also leads to my next question because, you know, because, well, I think I have some understanding of what the controls do, but I don't really know how that corresponds to the inside of a compressor, for example, like all the capacitors, like you said, transformer, tubes, resistors. So how can someone like me start to understand what the different components means in terms of sound, and if he has that magic people like you mentioned say sometimes about old transformers, for example, if that makes sense.
I don't think there's any way to explain that really quick.
Right.
I mean, I just wouldn't believe everything you hear and to try things out and see what you think yourself. I mean, that's the most important thing is to run something through whatever you're doing and be honest with yourself. Does that sound better or worse?
Mm-hmm.
And that's why it's a good mixer just has a lot of experience. There's no way to really be an amazing mixer unless you have a lot of practice with your own ears. You can get on gear sluts and read all day long about what sounds good and doesn't, and it wouldn't apply to you at all, when you use it yourself or with your own music. So uh, reading gear sluts is fun, and listening to what other people uh, say is cool and entertaining, but there's no way to make that useful unless you actually try it out and get more experience doing what you do. So don't even listen to anything I say. It's all kind of subjective crap, in my opinion.
Right.
You can get pointers about things, but when somebody says, "Oh, this has so much air, it just makes the mix just the bottom end is just sounds like a whatever field with cows grazing." I don't know. It's like that's just not going to apply to you.
Mm-hmm.
And so just know that.
Right.
Don't stop listening to people and having fun reading about things, but understand that just because you go out and buy some piece of gear, it's not going to be what you imagined it to be usually.
Yeah, that's very true, man. Is there anything you have read on, for example, gear sluts that was a complete myth, uh, or anything like that?
Um, Usually when I go on gear sluts, it's because I hear of some kind of bizarre piece of equipment and I want to see if what people's opinions are on it.
Right.
And through that, I can kind of sum up, knowing what I know, what it's about, more or less. But I always read the kind of knowing how things work, so I can extract what I want from it. Like, say I've been interested in dynamic compressors lately, and there's this dynamic compressor made by this company BSS, and it's the DPR 901, and it was not many people made dynamic EQs. Did I say compressors? I meant
Yeah.
dynamic EQ.
Right. Right.
Not many people made analog dynamic EQs, but since plugins have been doing that more often, like the new FabFilter Pro Q3. They added dynamics to the bands, and I think I started using that more in mastering, and I think it's really cool. It's a little different than multi-band compressing, very similar, but it's more of an afterthought. Like if I'm EQing something and I don't want to pull up a whole another multi-band compressor to control some high end or something, I'll just start, pull down the threshold on that high band I had. And sometimes that does it for me without having to open a whole new plugin. So I started looking around for analog versions because I'm thinking of making one. And so I, heard about this old dynamic EQ, and I went on Gearslust to see what people said about it, and yeah, that's, now I have an idea of what it does, but
Right.
of course I'll want to play with it to see what I really think about it,
Yeah.
So I don't think there's anything wrong, but, just don't take anybody's word for anything. Maybe get an idea about what something's about and then try it yourself.
Right. Yeah, that's a good advice, man. But since you make obviously analog gear, you have your Magic Death Eye compressor, and EQ. Do you think digital is still as good as analog, or there's still a difference?
Well, with plugins and stuff, I'd say you can master great or mix great in the box. I've heard tons of great mixes and great masters that are just done with plugins. I think analog's cool because it's fun and tactical, but I don't think there's anything special about analog now that something in a plugin can't do. There's so many distortion plugins and clipping plugins, and that's why if I was recording music, I would always want to record things as clean and accurately as possible, then artistically distort it in the box. Now you can do that. Back in the old days, you'd have to kind of, that's where all the magic, this has a tone, it's like, yeah, you're adding some distortion through that preamp or that compressor, and it just happened to sound great, and now the mixer knows that that's a sound that he can get when he uses that analog gear. But it's very confined to just that. Now, just get things in there clean and be creative in the box, and that's what's great about digital stuff. But no, I don't think you really need, you still need a nice mic pre and microphones. I think that's, if you're a beginning engineer, the best thing to spend your money on is microphones.
Right.
Good microphones. And get one great vintage microphone, because there's plenty of boutique copies out there now. But when they made those original microphones, there was actual scientists and engineers, not hacks like me, just putting parts together, who were really trying to do something scientific. And when they wound the transformers for the FET or the tube, and they built the capsule, they were really going for something. And you can hear that in those old mics. They're very accurate. And so yeah, invest in a really nice microphone, and then that way you can buy boutique microphones and cheap microphones and compare it to that and go, okay, this is going to work for this or that, or this has a great sound, because you have to get lucky to have a boutique microphone sound as nice as a vintage microphone. Again, it's all subjective, but that's my advice. And then good speakers and a good acoustic environment. After that, you're great with plugins. You don't need one more piece of analog gear. You can do everything and make incredible recordings. And I know that's true because I've mastered incredible recordings where the engineer's been like, oh yeah, I mixed this all in the box. And it's like, wow, this is the most analog mix I've ever heard,
Right.
So it's completely possible that you don't need to use any analog gear anymore. And I don't know why I'm saying that, because I sell analog gear. You don't need this stuff.
Yeah, your plugin is also available. Your compressor is also available as a plugin, right?
Oh, you froze there for a second. Yes, I worked with a company called DDMF, and I worked with the Christian, who's the owner of the company, And we worked for about a year going back and forth. I sent him a real unit, and he's got a PhD in physics, and he really modeled that plugin well. And it turned out to be something really special, and I think a lot of people really like it. And it was a proud moment for me because I felt like, my analog gear is really expensive, and I would like a lot of people to experience it. And the fact that it's in a plugin, that's great. I don't make hardly any money at all off the plugins,
Right.
but I really like the fact that anybody can use them, and about $100 for the plugin,
Right.
and I would say go with that. And then one day, if you have money, and buy a real one, but you don't need a real one.
Right.
Now that and we're going to do a version of the stereo also. I have a mono compressor and stereo compressor,
Right.
and they're similar, but there's different things. There's an EQ now in the stereo compressor, and that's going to be cool to put into the plugin. So yeah, I love digital recording and mastering, and I still use analog stuff in my mastering because it's fun,
Yeah.
and I have this beautiful compressor I built.
Yeah, exactly.
Want to use it,
Yeah, for sure.
but I could master all digitally and probably do just as well. But what's the fun?
Yeah, no, I agree, man. It's fun to use analog stuff. But so what I'd love to know is when you decide that you need to pull out a compressor, what are your thought process? Like, is there something specific you hear in your head, and the compressor is the thing to get that desired result from? For example.
Yeah, I mean, there's two ways of doing it. One is just to throw a compressor on something and see what it sounds like, and maybe it'll sound cooler than the original thing. A lot of times it does, but then when you put it into a mix, it doesn't. Sometimes I hear when I'm mastering, yes, I hear something in my head. Usually, hey, the track needs a little bit more excitement.
Right.
And with the whole attack and release thing, you can bring out the kick drum and the snare drum a little bit more. And I don't like to do it too much because most of the mixes I get really sound good as they are now. But if I feel like something needs a little bit more excitement, I'll put a couple of dBs of compression on it and have a slower attack and a quicker release, so the transients of the drums in the song can come out a little bit more, and everything seems to sound a little bit more exciting. So yeah, I mean, sometimes the client doesn't want that. Sometimes they're happy that I did it. You can always take it off, but now since I've been mastering for so long, I have, usually when I listen to a song, I hear what I want it to sound like after I'm done, so I can use the correct tools to get it there. When I first started out, I would use the tools and see what sound they made, and I think that applies to all recording. Use a lot of tools, play with them, and eventually you'll understand what things do, and you can hear something in your head and apply it after that.
But I think we mentioned this before, but like the difference between a FET or a Vari-mu or Opto and all those different compressors. What was my question? Yeah, how do they affect which kind of compressor you reach for? Because a FET can do this, a Chew one can do that. Is that something that's part of your thinking process too, or?
Yeah, a little bit. If I want something to be controlled a lot, I'll maybe use like an SSL plugin or something, because it has a certain time. It really squeezes and grabs things. If I want it to just be like a loose, barely there type of compression, then maybe something more like a tube compressor plugin would work better. But again, you just experiment with the different plugins and see which one. Just be honest with yourself again. Does this make it sound better or worse? Worse. So I'll try something else. I don't think it's really important to know, I need a VCA compressor here, or I need a Vari-mu tube. I think it's important that you just try different things, and whatever works the best and sounds the best, use that. There's no rules,
Right. Yeah, that's good, man. That makes sense. Because I always thought about like tube compressors versus a FET compressors to be so tubes being slower than a FET. Is that true, or is this my?
Yeah, I mean, there's the absolute quickest something can be, and then there's just the controls available in the design. Um, the faster you get, the more distortion you're going to get because you're getting closer to just clipping a wave. So, yeah, FETs can be run very fast, especially in the 1176 circuit. Something like it's more not the type of element that you're using, but it's the circuit that it's being used in. So certain compressors are known for different things. You could have a FET compressor that's really slow just because that's the way the circuit was designed.
Right.
Because those capacitors and timing elements inside it were designed a certain way for a certain function. So, yeah, some things are known for being certain ways, but you could have another company make things with the same elements
Right.
and the circuit different, and it would respond and react differently.
Right. That's cool. I didn't know that, actually.
Yeah, and it depends. The element does have to do, there's a lot of distortion involved, and, you know, a VCA can pull signals down 20 dB with very low distortion because of the way they work. A FET or a tube pulling the signal down, as you pull the signal down, the distortion gets worse.
Right.
So that's color, you know. So the more you compress things, the more colorful it gets. That's something that I would say would be more of a factor in the way things are going to sound than the speed. You can usually control the speed with the controls on the unit, but how distorted it's going to be at a certain amount of compression really has to do with the sound, what kind of sound you're going to get from that compressor.
Right. Yeah, because you can get pretty a lot of low end distortion from the stock Pro Tools compressor. What's it called? Dynamic 3, whatever it's called. Like if you put it on the fastest attack, you can get some pretty cool low end distortion. So,
that's the timing thing. That's because it's trying, especially that's what look ahead in digital is about.
Right.
And if you don't have a look ahead on, I don't know if the stock compressor has that, but if the compressor can look ahead, it can turn down a transient slower ahead of time.
Right.
If it can't look ahead, it's just going to clip it because it's immediately down. The transient comes through and it has to just dive down instantly, and that's clipping, and that's going to add distortion. If it can look ahead and slowly turn down the transient, then you can hear that transient. That's why the L2 was such a big revolution, because it was able to look ahead and turn down the volume of the transients without clipping them. So you could get all the energy in the lower volume areas could be turned up in comparison to the higher transients, and the higher transients wouldn't be as distorted. That's why you can get louder without hearing audible distortion. Before the L2, mastering engineers would clip the signal and, you know, get as much of that lower volume stuff to come up and be equal to the higher volume stuff, making the song sound fuller by just clipping the signal. But you could only go so far with that without it just really sounding distorted. And a lot of things really sound distorted from that era. You know, you can hear vocals distort because, you know, it was more important to the engineer to have the song sound more exciting and full than it was to have it completely clean. You know?
Right. So how does a look ahead work, especially in an analog piece of gear? It seems like that would have
There
to
is
be.
no analog gear with look ahead.
Oh, there's not.
No.
Oh, so you said L2. I was
I think
thinking about the.
actually EMT made a compressor that had a small amount of look ahead by putting the signal through analog all pass filters. Every time you EQ something, you change the phase of it. So it would EQ the whole frequency width, the whole bandwidth, and in that way it could delay the signal and send the signal that wasn't delayed to the sidechain and be able to turn down the music a couple milliseconds or fractions of a millisecond before the music actually got there.
Right.
So the sidechain could work ahead of time.
That's
But
cool.
that did give you the best fidelity going through all those all-pass filters
Right.
in the world. So, like tape delay,
Hmm.
an analog delay, back in the old days would go through a bucket brigade chip, and why it sounds, the high end sounds rolled off on old analog delays. Before digital, the only way to delay things was put it through a bucket brigade chip where it actually, it's too hard to explain how that works, but it pulls off a lot of high end when you put it through those old guitar pedals that had analog delay. That's what sounds so cool, because it's all rolled off and distorted. An all pass filter, you could do it less distorted, but it took a lot of components to do that, and you can't get that much delay with all pass filters unless you made a really long one. Again, too hard to explain. Yeah, so that's the only device analog that I know that ever had a look ahead.
Right.
So yeah, that's why they couldn't do that in mastering. They couldn't get things as loud without clipping them and distorting them as they can now, because in digital you can delay the whole, the whole song.
Yeah.
You can delay as long as you want and work on, literally like a volume fader, turning down those transients, and then feeding them to the compressor.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, it's very interesting, man. Because I think when you mentioned L2, right? I think I thought about LA2A for some reason when you said L2.
Oh no, the Waves L hardware,
Yeah,
when that came out.
right.
Yeah, I think that was one of the first, commercially available look ahead limiters, and it wasn't analog; it was digital, even though it was a hardware unit. But that started to allow the whole volume wars thing, because people could get the apparent volume of the song a lot louder by, turning down the louder parts of the song and the transients. Therefore, you could hear what was going on and lower volume things, elements in the mix, which made everything sound fuller, because you were just hearing more sound, more energy. And yeah, that led to things being pushed crazily.
Yeah.
But that's cool too. That's an art form, I guess.
Yeah, I guess so.
But it used to hear things like that. It's like if something isn't limited and compressed, it's like, hey, this doesn't sound exciting. It's like you need a really good song to not have to do that to and make it sound exciting. Which, there's not a lot of. Well, that's not true. There's a lot of great music out here, but out now. But like say Dark Side of the Moon. I think a long time ago I read some interview with the engineer who did that, and he was like, no, I didn't put any compression on the drums at all. Heck no, I wouldn't do that.
Right.
And that's it's an amazing record. You wouldn't say, oh, hey, this is great, except for there's no compression on the drums, so they sound weak. No, it's just a great songs and great musicianship. So
yeah,
a lot of times compression and limiting is a band-aid, unexciting mix or song.
Yeah.
Which is fine, whatever.
No, but you're right, man, because it's all down to the song in the end. All this is just irrelevant, I guess, to some degree. It's all about the song, first of all.
Yeah.
Yeah. Come down to my last question here, or maybe two more. But you spoke about it during the interview. Sidechain, obviously, sidechain is how a compressor works, but sidechain is usually thought about having a different source triggering the compressor that you want to compress, right? Could you explain how the signal flow is in a compressor quickly? So, because you have the signal coming through, and then you have the sidechain who controls the signal, right?
Yes.
That's
so say like a FET, you have the signal coming in, you have the FET hanging off the signal to ground, then you have the amplifier, the audio amplifier that puts the signal to the output. And right after that, usually the second amplifying stage, you take they take the signal, the AC signal, and it goes into what I call the sidechain, the circuitry that controls the timing of the control voltage.
Right.
And like I said, and this is called a feedback compressor.
Right.
DBX compressors, are older ones, are feed forward, where they take the signal from the to the timing elements, the sidechain signal, from before the gain reducing element.
Right.
And the problem with that is there's no feedback. It has to completely rely on the incoming signal not being affected to put back into the gain reduction element. When you take it from after the gain reduction element at the output, when this compresses, when the gain reduction element reduces the gain is also reduced into the sidechain. So it's kind of feeding back on itself, and there's more control that way. There's not that many feed forward compressors out there. Right. Most are feedback. Most take the signal from after the gain reduction element and feed it into the timing capacitors and resistors and feed it back into the element to pull down the gain according to what's coming out. That's cool. That's the way it works.
Yeah.
I had a whiteboard. I'd
yeah.
do it, but I don't.
Yeah, man. And lastly, do you have a favorite failure? That's something that set you up for later success, whatever that is in life or studio, music.
Yes and no. Because if it's a failure and I'm more successful because of it, it's not a failure.
Sure. Yeah.
No, I'm failing all the time, every day. I guess the things that were most pertinent were when I was beginning to learn how to master, and I was doing that when I was a tech here, and I was doing it at home, and I'd master things for friends for free, and just to get my chops, just to understand what it was all about. And a lot of times I'd send songs to people and they'd be like, oh yeah, dude, that's not that great, or and it would hurt my feelings, and I'd be like, why? And but it forced me to change. Well, I must not be doing something right, because if you feel like you have good taste in music, if something that sounds great to you also sounds great to other people in general, then that's all you really need to have. And you need to keep failing until you can. That's what I learned early on. I would master something and it would be compressed and it would sound exciting, but it didn't sound great to my soul, so to speak. Like, I knew it could be better in some ways, and sometimes that was just because of the mix, because I was doing crappy mixes from friends for free. But I would send it, and they would have the same feeling it's not that great, dude. And so I started really mastering and trying different things, until I could walk out of the room and then come back in and press play and go, wow, that sounds great to me, without thinking about anything I did. If it didn't, then I would try harder to make it sound great, so to speak, without thinking about the process that got me there.
Right.
But yeah, a lot of failures trying to learn to master, and having a lot of friends tell me that it sucked, until I started realizing how to do things. And then I started realizing also I'd get really crappy mixes, and I'd say ahead of time, like, look, dude, I can only do so much with this. Right. So, but what's funny is, actually, as I got more successful and better at mastering, I started doing better mixes, and now most of the mixes I get don't need much mastering at all. Right. And one of my skills is knowing when not to do anything to it. Like going, oh, this is a great sounding mix, I don't need to screw it up. So I'll maybe put a dB of limiting on it and send it back. A lot of times good mixers appreciate that, Sometimes they are really happy with their mix, but the label and the producer want to get it mastered, even though it really doesn't need it. And they're happy when it comes back sounding pretty much just like the mix they sent.
Right. Yeah. I guess that takes experience, from like you said, like you've done it so many times, and yeah, experience
Yeah,
essentially.
unless you're just have no taste and no talent, go to a different, you know, do something else with your life. But most people have the ability to listen to something and go, wow, that sounds good. And
Mm,
then it just takes a process of failures and time to figure out, how to get there.
yeah,
And anybody can do it. And it seems pretty easy to me now. I know I spent my whole life recording music and playing music and, working with these tools. And yeah, I mean, I'm 47 now. So it feels easy to me, but when I look back, it took a lot of time. So somebody in their 20s going, man, why can't I mix or master? Why doesn't my stuff sound like that? There's a million different reasons, but don't give up
mm,
unless you just don't know what obviously something sounds good to you, something inspires you. So just keep, striving to copy, to emulate, read gear sluts, see what the people say. Just don't, take anything to heart because it's all subjective, it's all opinions. But
mm,
learn from it, try things yourself, and eventually you'll get there.
yeah,
That's, almost impossible not to. If you get frustrated on the way there, if it's just killing you and you're not enjoying it at all, then yeah, get a different thing to do, a different job.
yeah, yeah, exactly, man. Something I've been seeing a lot online recently is how you should deliver mix to a mastering engineer. Uh, is there such a thing, such a rule, or?
Well, yes and no. I feel like a good mixer. I've gotten really loud, limited mixes, and if it sounds good, again, to me on my speakers, which I know really well, and I have a treated room and really nice speakers, then that's how he should have sent it to me. If something sounds really crushed, the mixer isn't that great. I feel like if he would take whatever limiters and compressors off the main bus, I could be more creative and I could fix it, so to speak. I could have more leeway to fix it. If everything's crushed and there's not a lot of dynamic information there, I can't do much with it.
Mm,
Um, so it all depends. There is really no correct way to uh, deliver a mix. Like, say, I cut the Alabama Shakes record a while ago,
mm,
their
cool.
first big record, and um, the mixer, his name is
Sean Everett. Yeah.
Sean Everett. His style of mixing is just crush everything to the limit, and it really
Okay.
worked on that Alabama Shakes record because they're good players. The music was really sparse, as
Mm,
far as instrumentation. But Bob Ludwig from Gateway mastered it, and I got those masters to cut, and they were so compressed and loud. I was thinking, well, if I had a little less limited mix here, it might sound cooler being cut, and it will be a little different than the digital stuff. And the producer on that was Blake Mills,
mm,
and I asked him, and he said, no, man, Bob had to turn those mixes down.
mm.
So
Right.
I've never really heard of a mastering guy turning things down. So, and that's a super hit record, and it was, blown out to all hell as far as loudness when it was delivered. So
Right.
there is no right or wrong way. Usually mastering engineers like it to be a little bit more dynamic,
Mm,
but if you're confident in your mix skills, you like something crushed like that, that's how you want it to sound,
mm.
send it to the mastering guy like that,
Yeah.
and he'll know what to do.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good advice, man. And as I said, it all depends
It
on
all
the
depends.
source. Yeah.
Just send it however you want, and then the mastering engineer will tell you, hey, these are. It may take more time and energy. And mastering engineers are like, oh, I don't want to have to listen to this, and then wait another couple days to get
Mm,
new mixes. So sometimes it's good not to crush the crap out of it if you're not sure. If you're
right.
sure about what you're doing as a mixer, and usually mixers who are sure know, they send what they want to send.
Right.
You're not sure, then maybe send something not as crushed.
Mm,
Uh, and it really doesn't matter as far as overall level. You could send, I've gotten waves that, on Pro Tools, it looks like a thin little line. I
mm,
just turn it up.
right.
Digital noise is not that noisy. So you can get away with a lot of headroom. if you're unsure, give the guy some headroom.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good advice, man. Thanks. So before we wrap up here, where can people find more info about you, your compressor, and your if you have a website, where can they hire you?
Well, my magicdeatheye.com is my equipment site. We do online services at Capitol. You just go to the Capitol Records website. Yeah, one thing I was going to say about my compressors is I feel bad because I can't build them since I work during the day at Capitol mastering. I don't have as much time as I would like to build compressors, so I build them very slow.
Right.
And then I do this thing where if you sign up for my website emailing list, you just have to put your email and name in there. And I do an email blast when I'm done with the compressor. And the first one to email me back can buy it.
Ah, cool.
Some people get frustrated with that because they've been waiting and then they're not the first one to email back.
Right.
All I can say about that is eventually when I put more out, less people will want them. It's not like tons of people want them, but I would say actually just go buy something else. Like, don't buy my compressors. They're great. There's a company called Knife who does great Vari-mu compressors.
Right.
Electronaut, that's another boutique guy who does great stuff.
Right.
There's tons of stuff out there. Just don't worry about, and don't hire me to be a mastering guy either. I got plenty of. So,
Yeah.
no way.
I mean, they can just start with your plugin, maybe.
Yes, buy the plugin. That is definitely it. Go to DDMF. .eu, I think it is, and download the plugin. It's pretty cheap and it's great. It works on everything.
Cool.
And look out for more plugins to come.
Great. Awesome. Well, thank you, Ian. It was Ian, not Ian.
Yes.
I learned that. Cool, man. Well, thank you very much, and it was a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
To you.
Thanks for taking the time to pick my brain.
Yeah, awesome, man. Thanks. Thank you, Ian, for coming. It was awesome talking to you, and hope you, the listener, enjoyed it as well. Before you leave, please let me know in the comments if you have any questions about compression, maybe what your favorite compressor is. Do you have a Fairchild? Do you need to replace your tubes? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to download the free guide, 3 tested ways to increase your client base. And that's it. Leave a comment, subscribe, all that sort of things. And I'll see you guys next week.